Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Hello, my darlings. Long time no see, right? Well, I am trying to get my equipment to behave itself and work. So we'll see how this goes. Here's a short one to see, hopefully that, things are going to get back on track. I've missed doing this. I've missed you guys very much. But here's hoping for picking it up again. So I'm starting off again with a story from our dear Bear Lair 64. This one is called Alien Chamber. The muffled voices once again disturbed the earthling from his slumber. The chamber in which he was kept shuddered, and the walls, constructed of flexible but very strong fibers, closed in on him briefly. Then the shattering, racking sound slammed into him. If he shrieked from the intense pain and discomfort, no one would know. The noises were deafening. He had vague memories of other such events. He knew that the omnipresent pronoun beings he conceived of as they would continue the roaring vibrations until he was near madness, left weak and exhausted before they ceased. The muffled speaking would grow in volume and excitement for a time, as though they reveled in torturing him. Each time he'd come to awareness of late, he noted that his chamber had grown smaller, more confined. Noises constantly assailed him in the complete darkness. He knew that he was unconscious much of the time. Time had, in fact, held little meaning anymore. He was kept in perpetual near slumber with only hints of nightmares at the edges of his occasionally waking mind, to prove that he existed at all anymore. He had been held in the restrictive environment for so long that he was unable to properly control his muscles. His nerves did not seem to deliver the proper messages, and when he could manage a clumsy, club-fisted strike or awkward kick, it was weak and ineffective, and followed almost immediately by more pressure on the wet chamber in which he was held prisoner. Sometimes sounds would admit that were clearly designed to calm him, yet they were muffled, and in some garbled tongue he had no way to recognize, much less decipher. He couldn't recall how it had all begun. He had simply awakened one day in the chamber. They, with their shouted, nonsensical mumbling, had intruded on his need for constant rest. Whatever had come before, it had induced a great fatigue. When conscious, he often felt the sensation of motion, as though the vessel that contained his chamber hurled across great distances of space. Yet he was always cushioned. They had supplied a type of fluid, insulation, that filled his chamber and protected him from most pain. It was, no doubt, also part of the suspended animation process. He wondered how long they had been traveling since his abduction. He couldn't quite recall the location of his homeworld, or the name of it. It was an odd realization. He didn't know his own origins. He began to develop a new sensation, an emptiness in his middle, hunger. Until recently, they'd fed him directly by a tube. It was painless, if odd. It seemed to remove waste, even as it nourished his form. The chamber now tightly constricted around him, and he knew that he would soon have to leave it or be crushed by its otherwise forgiving walls. He could not fathom the changes, but it seemed that they were bringing him out of hibernation. He grew immediately terrified. He knew that he would be unable to resist their ministrations. He was far too weak and inept from prolonged sedentariness. He wasn't even sure that he'd be able to see, since he had been kept so long in complete darkness. At least he'd maintained his sanity. Hadn't he? He wasn't even sure of that, considering the holes in his memory. He noted a great increase in the sensation of movement. They likely drew near their final destination. Perhaps they'd entered the atmosphere of some planet or other celestial body. He wondered what new horrors he would have to endure. Then his chamber released the fluid that had been maintaining him for so long. The walls enclosed him, and he felt the sensation of falling headfirst into a bottomless chasm. His progress was cut short, but more soft cushioning. Then he was pushed forward, a little at a time. The walls seemed both reluctant to allow his release, and into the outside world, and at once anxious to be rid of him. He felt air on top of his head. Something gripped him. A wiggle of the shoulders, and he was free at last. His joy was short-lived, as he felt himself whisked on high and bright light slammed into his constricted pupils. As he suspected, all was a grayed-out blur, caused by the enforced darkness in which he had dwelt for who knew how long. The beings around him, they were enormous. He was surrounded and captured by monstrous creatures that kept their faces covered, perhaps to prevent contamination, or possibly to disguise their hideousness. He drew in all the air his lungs could contain and emitted a shriek of horror. Enormous hands probed at him and stuck painful objects into him, all the while their booming voices called out in their gibberish language. He detected a thin, wailing noise and realized it was him. His cries had not ceased since that initial outburst, yet despite the many pains that now assailed him, he finally stopped. The cries had done nothing to assuage the ferocious antagonism that these enormous beings clearly felt for him. Eventually they gave him to one of their kind, who held him closely so that he could not escape. He was weak, unable to voluntarily control his bodily functions, and they had wrapped him in some confining garment, similar to a straitjacket. It didn't matter. On his best day, he would have been unable to effectively tackle one of these monsters. The one that held him made shushing noises and odd, vaguely comforting sounds. He recognized the voice as the same one that had often calmed him during his time in the cell. He refused to be calmed. He was angry at the way he had been handled, like some poor, small creature in a lab. He felt that the thing wanted him to be quiet, and he resisted for as long as he was able. Eventually, he yielded. Many things had changed, but the urge to rest and eat had not. He could do neither while raging at the injustice heaped upon him. He found himself on a liquid diet, but at least he was eating with his mouth like a normal human being. Apparently, the enforced inactivity of the hibernation chamber had caused his body to temporarily adjust how it processed food. He had endured yet another humiliation. He was unable to control the release of his bodily wastes, and was too weak and clumsy to correct the issue when they arose. Instead, he was reduced to calling out for the gigantic aliens to come and assist him. He often squeezed shut his eyes and cried out during the process to disguise his mortification. He soon found himself primarily in the care of the alien who'd attempted to comfort him. It still made attempts, but mostly left him to his thoughts. Others intruded occasionally, especially one that seemed to be the relief shift for the comforter. He had been even more terror-stricken when he had seen the faces of the beings without their face coverings. They were indeed hideous to behold, and their features were out of proportion to their face, each too big by far. Others came by occasionally. Most picked him up and examined him, each baring its teeth in a predatory display of domination. They groped at him and robbed him of the little dignity he possessed. He constantly looked for a means of escape, but found none. He struck them as best he was able, determined to resist to the best of his abilities. He refused to go quietly. Eventually, he determined that since his physical options were very limited, he needed more information so that he could use his mind to develop an effective plan. He'd have to do his best to learn their language. He set out to do so, and along the way, found that his strength and physical capabilities soon began to resume their growth. The process was agonizingly slow, and he was sure that he would go mad from the strain of loneliness, of having no one who shared his form of communication. At first, he perceived only single words that the Brobdingnagian horrors repeated regularly. One in particular seemed to be focused on him, especially when they drew close and gurgled out the hideous noises that passed for civil discourse among them. Apparently, it was what they called him. Baby. So quoth this raven. So tell me, my darlings, how far were you in before you realized what was going on? Let me know in the comments, please. And a big thank you to Bear for this story. I don't know when I'll be on a set schedule again, but we'll take it as it comes. I hope that's all right. And I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful day. Thank you for stopping by, my darlings. It means so much. I so enjoy telling these stories for you. And here are some of my marvelous supporters. Please, if you haven't subscribed, consider doing so. If you give this video a like, it would help me out ever so much. Thank you, and have a lovely, lovely day.